All right, so we're going to get started here. Thank you so much for being here for our FCI Live 2025 series. It's been 2 incredible weeks. This is our last session of our 2025 series, and what a session to wrap up with. We are very excited to have with us Katie Novak of Katie Novak Cooperative Coaching. This is Reimagining Co-op Funding. Before we dive in, I just want to take just a moment to thank our FCI Live champion sponsors. It's our third year of FCI Live, and we had one sponsor the first year, champion sponsor. We had two champion sponsors the second year. We have three this third year. Thank you so much to National Co-op Grocers, to Dot Co-op, and to Colluminate for making the series possible. All right, so we're going to be talking with Katie. I'm going to stop sharing so she can get her slides set up. This is a session that she proposed for Up and Coming. If you guys haven't been to Up and Coming, that's our national conference for startup food co-ops. It happened last September in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We will be back in Kalamazoo, Michigan in this coming September. But it was a terrific session, really talking about the new and innovative ways that co-ops are finding to now fund our co-ops, because how we fund startup co-ops has vastly changed in the last 5 to 7 years. And it was really popular, really amazing conversation. And so we asked Katie to bring it back and make sure that people who weren't able to be at Up and Coming got to learn from all of this wisdom that she's collected and the terrific way she shares it. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here today. Always glad to be part of SCI Live. And I didn't realize today was the actual last day. I thought maybe tomorrow there were sessions tomorrow too. So I'm it, Tom. This is the end. That's exciting. Good for you, huh, JQ? It's been, I'm sure, a great week. I've registered for quite a few sessions. I wasn't able to attend any of them in real time, but I can't wait to watch the recordings. These are always such a wealth of information. So very pleased to be here. Very happy to see you all, and encourage you to put your chat or your questions in the chat, as JQ said. And if we need immediate addressing, we will handle those. Otherwise, we'll take care of questions at the end. So as JQ said, I have been proposing this and did this session at the last Up and Coming conference. And the reason I did it is because I saw that things were changing in the landscape of funding for co-ops. I do consulting work for startup grocery co-ops, primarily around fundraising. I also do a little bit of nonprofit and social driven fundraising consulting work as well, but the bulk of my work happens in the co-op sector. And I was seeing things changing in terms of where funds are available and what kinds of co-ops we're organizing. And so in today's session, what I'd like to do is review some capital stack basics. So when we're talking about funding, we're talking about the pieces of the funding for your co-op, and that what we call that is the capital stack. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is and what it entails. And then we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about why we need to reimagine how we fund these stores and what's happening in the landscape that is requiring us to think about things a little bit differently. And then we'll go through some real life examples. In the session we did at Up and Coming, we had some time to do a breakout session or, some in-person idea sharing. Hopefully we'll have a little time to do a bit of that, but it'll take a little bit of different shape since we're virtual this time around. But let's get started with the capital stack. So when we're talking about capital stack, what we're talking about is the term, capital stack is the term we use to describe the funds that we're going to need to open our store, the mix of the money and the kinds of monies that we are going to need to open our stores. Typically, those kinds of funds fall into different buckets. Those buckets for us are owner equity, owner investments, that's typically loans and shares, donations, grants, and debt. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about each of these in a little more detail to put some context around what they are and what they mean for us. Owner equity, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, are the dollars that we accumulate when folks join our co-op, when people buy their ownership shares. That's what we qualify as owner equity. It's usually a smaller piece of our overall funding puzzle, but it's a very important piece of that puzzle. Owner investments are additional investments made by co-op owners in the form of loans and shares. Loans to the co-op are simply us, the co-op, borrowing money from our owners rather than borrowing money from the bank in a simple term or in simple terminology. Those loans have terms in terms of time. So right now we're seeing loan terms in the 10 to 15 year range, and they usually pay interest rates that vary from 0 to 5% ish right now we're seeing. Preferred shares, on the other hand, are additional investments in the co-op, additional shares of stock that owners can purchase that pay potential dividends at the discretion of the board. Those shares are non-voting shares, and they pay, as I said, they pay dividends, but they don't provide any additional voting privileges for the owner. So it doesn't change our one member, one vote um, premise that is so important to us in the cooperative world, but it allows our strongest supporters to invest more money in the store for a potential return in the future. Donations, pretty straightforward. I think we all understand what donations are. When we accept funds freely from a donor, either directly to the co-op or through a fiscal sponsor. When we do it directly to the co-op, of course, there's no tax benefit for the donor. If it's made through a fiscal sponsor, sometimes tax benefits apply depending on the donor's individual situation. The next bucket are grants. Grants are pools of funds, sums of money from entities. So this could be from foundations, it could be from government grants, it could be from businesses or foundations. I think I said foundations already. I think I said that twice, but that's okay. But it's a sum of money that we receive as a result of an entity's interest in our organization. It may be something we apply for. It may be a generous contributor that's funneling funds to us via a grant. And then the last piece of the puzzle is debt. Debt is when we're borrowing money and we're paying interest on that money. We're typically borrowing that money from a local bank or a cooperative lender, someone who understands what we're doing and agrees with our mission and can work with us in terms of creating a loan that is amenable to both the lender and the co-op. So let's look at how co-op funding has changed. And I want to change where my Zoom thing is here so I can see more of you guys. Okay, so this is what a capital stack looked like when I started working on fundraising in the co-op world. This was back in 2015. So in 2015, we were seeing about 10% of our overall funding puzzle coming from owner equity. And as a reminder, that's us purchasing our ownership shares in the co-op. We saw about 40% coming from owner investments. So those are the preferred shares that we talked about and the loans. We saw a small amount of donations. About 15% of our funds were coming from donations and a really small amount of grants. Just 5% of our money at that time was coming from grants. And a good chunk of it was coming from bank debt. Now, if you fast forward to 2024, this is what a capital stack looks like more recently. So we've got owner equity, still a significant piece of the puzzle, but a little bit higher than we saw in 2015. Owner investments has shrank significantly. So in the previous slide, I think that was 40%. We're seeing 11% of the funding needed to open our stores coming from owner investments. Those are preferred shares and loans. Donations and grants make up this biggest piece of the puzzle here. 54% of the funds we need to open our store are coming from donations and grants, and just a small amount of bank debt and a small amount of what we're calling public funding. And so just to elaborate a little bit on what public funding could include, sometimes this takes the shape of new market tax credits or tax subsidies, or ways municipalities are finding creative solutions to cooperative funding. So that may be in the shape of a low cost lease, or a municipality that owns a building for us and makes it available to us. So this can be the public funding bucket can be quite a variety of things, but we're seeing more and more co-ops get more and more creative in how they partner with local municipalities and entities in terms of their funding. So why? Why are we seeing this change? Why does the 2015 capital stack look so different from the current day capital stack? And we all remember a pretty big thing that happened to us recently called the pandemic. And that really shifted a lot of things for us across the board in the cooperative world and across the whole world, whatever sector we're talking about here. Many things have changed as a result of the pandemic. One of them being significant increase in costs. We're seeing inflation at record levels, and project costs for co-ops are skyrocketing. In fact, a co-op who started organizing pre-pandemic and finished building their co-op during or after the pandemic likely saw a very significant change in overall project costs. And many of those co-ops had to raise additional funds to cover those increased costs that they incurred as a result. In addition, there have been some co-ops recently that haven't been as successful as we would have liked them to have been, or may not have had the success as quickly as we forecasted that they would. And so banks are beginning to think about how they lend to us differently when they see this track record. As I mentioned when we first started our session, the demographics of the kinds of co-ops that are organizing has changed. When I started doing this work back in 2015, it was, to be 100% honest, and it was a whole bunch of people who looked like me in middle class America trying to open co-ops because we wanted access to good food. And that's not the trend necessarily that we're seeing now. We're seeing a need and a demand for access to food in all kinds of different communities. And those demographics dictate different funding sources. What works in middle class America doesn't necessarily work in an urban, high density population that may be low income. And so we have to reimagine, what does that look like for us? How can we fund these kinds of stores, and where can we get the capital we need to be successful? I would have, until very recently, I would have said the expansion of grant availability was to our advantage. We have in the past year seen some significant grant funds available through the USDA, through the Illinois Grocery Initiative, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But those things are changing now. So just as we're creating these slides, or we're reviewing these slides, we know full well that the reality of grant funding is in question right now. But because of the existence of the grant funding and the fact that co-ops were having success these past few years in securing grants, pointed us in the direction that things are changing. Things aren't quite looking the way that they have looked in the past. And we're seeing co-ops focus more specifically on donation-based fundraising. In 2015, when I started this work, donations were afterthought. In fact, the only reason we took donations is because someone asked us if we could. We were on a mission to secure loans for the co-op at the time I started, and the only impetus for securing donations was demand. And so each co-op that I've worked with since 2015, each cooperative capital campaign I've worked with, we've seen an uptick in that figure related to donations. Every co-op sees larger and larger percentages of their funds coming from donations. And co-ops are spending more time and energy cultivating those relationships and building communication strategies to encourage donations. Okay, so because of all of these things, we're seeing less bank debt available. Co-ops are taking out loans and are working with banks, but at a lower level than we have seen in the past. And bank loans are expensive. It's quite costly for us as cooperatives to borrow money from the bank when we can borrow it at a cheaper cost from our owners or through preferred shares. And when we're looking at our pro forma, which is the set of financials we use to evaluate the co-op's potential success over the next 10 years, it's a forecasting tool. We see that we can't afford a lot of debt. It's really a struggle for most co-ops to include debt in their pro forma. And we have to, as a result, find unique and cheaper ways to raise the money that we need to open our stores. Okay, so we're going to look at some real life examples of co-ops that are doing these unique and innovative things to raise money to open their stores. And before we get to these examples, I'll share with you that these are examples that um, I don't know what the right word is, researched. I don't know, I know about these things because of my connection to the co-op world, because of the connection and the communication I have within our industry. But that does not necessarily mean that I'm an expert or representative of the co-ops that we're going to talk about here today. When I created these slides back in September, for up and coming. I had conversations with each of these co-ops, and if you are from one of the co-ops represented in one of these examples here today, I hope you'll chime in and correct me if I misstate something or if something has changed since September. But I really wanted to talk about and share examples of what's happening in the real world. Because as an organizer, when I was in your shoes, when I was actively working to fund my startup co-op, or my home co-op, knowing what other co-ops had done was so motivational to me, and having someone to connect with at that co-op that could answer my questions and give me feedback was really vital, and a really big piece of my cooperative development. Hopefully will be part of your cooperative development too. So the slides that we're going to show here are going to be real co-ops, and I encourage you to reach out to those co-ops, talk with someone there, and ask questions of them if and when you get to the point that it makes sense for you to have those kinds of conversations. So let's start with our first example. Gem City Market. So Gem City Market is in Dayton, Ohio. And what we saw with Gem City Market was a significant change in the reliance on owner investments. So the only owner investment included in their capital stack was equity. So they did not rely on loans or shares. Although I think that may have changed recently. At the time we made these slides, they may have done a capital campaign,
It was a donor campaign.
donor campaign. Okay,
Yep.
okay. So that still remains true. Um, they did have significant grant funding, probably one of the first co-ops that we saw with a really huge portion of their capital stack coming from grant funding. And they had a great relationship with the municipality and government, and had some public funding available to them. And they took out very limited bank debt. So let's take a look at what that capital stack actually looks like for Gem City. So we've got their owner equity here at just 9% of their funding puzzle. Owner investments aren't even showing up on the puzzle, on the pie chart, because they didn't include them. Grants and donations, 56% of their overall funding came from grants and donations, a small amount from bank debt. They used new market tax credits, and that took up a significant chunk of their funding. 21% of their funding came from new market tax credits. And I am not an expert in new market tax credits, and I have attended a couple of sessions at Up and Coming and other formats to learn about them. It's kind of, a fuzzy
Super
thing,
complicated. I
right?
was just going to mention we actually just recorded a session last week on them with some
Okay,
experts who broke it down. So when you get the links for the videos, if you want to try and understand it, you can go watch that video, but it is not easy to explain.
awesome. I am going to be watching that video for sure. But this is a great example of how things are changing, what's happening in the real world in terms of changes in the capital stack. So let's take a look at another example here. My slides are very slowly uh, moving. I don't know why, but well, I'll take it as a sign that maybe I need to take a breath and slow down. Public, municipal, and government support. That's a type of funding that we're seeing a lot of change in our industry. I've got three examples here that we're going to talk through. One being the Illinois Grocery Initiative, The second one, Prairie Food Co-op, which is in Illinois, and the third one being Three Sisters Market. So let's start with the Illinois Grocery Initiative. If you are a cooperator from Illinois, maybe you could put that in the chat. Um, I was going to try to look at the chat, but that's too much to do right now. But so Illinois has a program called the Illinois Grocery Initiative. Their governor has been instrumental in making funds available to eliminate food deserts in Illinois. It's a complicated program. It's a big package of dollars. I want to say I have it down here somewhere. 35 million. I don't know. I'll get you the dollar figure, but there's two pools of money available through the Illinois Grocery Initiative, one for equipment upgrades. So existing grocery stores can apply for grant funding to replace equipment with equipment that is more energy efficient. So that is a really cool program available to any grocery store that fits certain requirements. And this is an initiative that's geared at mom and pop or non-corporate grocers. So this is not something, that Kroger or Tom Thumb or any of those kinds of grocery stores would have access to, but co-ops would have access to. The local mom and pop in a rural community would have access to. And it's a significant amount of dollars that the governor and the state of Illinois are making available. The second pool of funding, JQ, did you have
I
something
was
to
letting you
add
know
there?
that Southside did we have one Illinois co-op in the room.
Ooh. Oh, yay, Southside. Awesome. And Southside, hopefully you're well aware of these initiatives at the Illinois Grocery Initiative funding. But the second pool of money that is available through the Illinois Grocery Initiative is for new grocery stores in food deserts. And it's designed for creative solutions to the food desert problem. So they're looking at city-owned grocery stores, cooperatively owned grocery stores. They're looking very creatively at how they can help bridge the gap to improve food access in Illinois. And I mentioned this because these kinds of things can happen anywhere. This is happening in Illinois right now, but that doesn't mean it can't happen in Iowa or Missouri or California, even for that matter. And knowing what's happening in the industry, knowing who's running those programs, knowing how those programs are working can help you in your home state have conversations with your city, your state, your governor even. There's nothing stopping us from having a relationship with all of our elected officials and talking to them about the cool things that are happening in our industry that could happen here in our home state as well. So I share this as inspiration for you to pay attention to what's happening across the landscape and learn what you can from what's happening and bring it home. Bring the pieces home to you that make sense for you and your co-op. Let's see here. What else did I want to say? Okay, so Illinois, our Prairie Food Co-op is the second example that I want to talk about. Prairie Food Co-op is in Lombard, Illinois. They are in the home stretch of raising the last bit of funds they need to right this very minute. So if you are interested in paying attention to how co-ops raise money and what that looks like, I encourage you to follow them on social media, get on their email list, and pay attention to what they're doing. Because they have raised, over $4 million, and they're finishing up their fundraising right now. A piece of their fundraising, I think it's $807,000, if I remember correctly. It is $807,000 of their funding came through the Rebuild Illinois Downtown Main Street program, and that was facilitated through some discretionary funding through through their U.S. representative. So Prairie Food Co-op did an excellent job of building a relationship with their elected officials. They invited them to events. They asked them, to participate. They kept them up to date on what was happening with the co-op. And as a result, they built a solid relationship with their representatives who then in turn made funds available to them through this discretionary funding. And this is happening more and more frequently. There are multiple co-ops that have had strong relationships with elected officials that have resulted in funding. So I encourage you to continue to build relationships. If you haven't started yet, you should start building relationships with your elected officials. And I mean from the lowest level to the highest level, your city council representatives, your county board, your mayor, your state representatives, your national representatives, your senator, all the way up the chain, your governor, all of these relationships, the more people who know about what you're doing and understand what you need, that's a big piece of the puzzle. Having the relationship with them is one thing, but having them know what you need as an organizer and as a co-op will help them fill that need. And so being able to articulate clearly what kind of funding you need, what you need it for, when you'll need it is really important. So I encourage you to use Prairie Food Co-op as your inspiration to build those relationships and pursue funding from unconventional sources like our legislative representatives. And then we've got Three Sisters Co-op, which is in Charlotte, North Carolina. Very unique funding model. They have a bazillion dollars of funding secured from lots of different entities from their county, from their city. They have a 99-year lease on their property, which was also negotiated through the municipality. They also were recipient of discretionary funds from a representative, and they've received ARPA funds, and they have received a multi-year commitment from Blue Cross Blue Shield through a grant. So they are an example of a breadth of creative sources of funding. They have looked at their legislative representatives and those relationships, their county, their city, local foundations, national grants, and Blue Cross Blue Shield, which does make funds available. And I have seen more and more co-ops have success in their relationship with Blue Cross Blue Shield because of the connection between food and health. They seem quite interested in the work that we're doing. So thinking outside the box in terms of where funding might exist is a big piece of this. And I encourage you to use Three Sisters as your motivation for doing that, for thinking outside of the box. What businesses, entities, organizations have similar values to ours, and where can we align ourselves with those organizations, and perhaps can we partner and leverage funds from those organizations? So thinking outside the box is really a really big piece of what we're doing when we're thinking about reimagining where our funding dollars come from. Okay, so the last example I have to share with you today is a unique example and also in Illinois, and that is the Rice Community Market. So at the time these slides were created back in September, Rice Community Market was probably a year and a half in existence, and they are a store in the southernmost tip of Illinois. They are in Cairo, Illinois, a very disinvested area of the state of Illinois. High poverty rates, very minimal services available, no grocery store in the town. They did have a Family Dollar, I believe, but very little access to fresh, healthy food. They have been working with the Illinois Cooperative Development Center through Western Illinois University and Sean Park to create a grocery store, and the store did open. It has now closed, I believe, temporarily, because they have a GM. They're having some GM turnover and some issues with sustainability, of the grocery store and funding. But it's a smaller footprint store. So I believe the store is 5,700 square feet. They did a very low cost renovation of an existing grocery store. So it was a grocery store at one point. They took over the store and refit it for their purposes. So very minimal costs there. And they had very little owner investment. They have owner equity and they had some preferred share sales, but very little. Most of their funding came from grants. They did have zero bank debt at the last interaction I had with them. But I know they were in talks with local lenders and cooperative lenders on some gap funding to help them stay afloat. And they worked with an independent distributor, which is, not necessarily traditional in terms of our model. They were working with a local food distributor, and we're seeing this type of store become more prevalent in Illinois. Sean has a very different way of organizing and facilitating cooperative development in Illinois, and it's unproven yet. We don't know how successful these stores will be. We don't know how sustainable these stores will be. And the fact that Rise is having some challenges indicates that perhaps the model is not 100% ironed out yet. But it's interesting to think about the work that we're doing in a different way and how might we adapt some of the things that Rise has instituted, like a smaller footprint or decreased costs, or looking at more grant funding than owner investment. How can we take some of what they're doing at their co-op and apply it to what we're doing at our co-op? So, at this stage of the game, what I want to do is open it up to you all. For questions. So, first we'll answer questions, and then I'd like you to spend some time thinking about these examples that we've talked about here today and how you might pull some of this information to use in your co-op and what that might look like for you. So, first, let's talk about questions.
All right, folks. Well, you can throw questions in the chat. And so we're going to encourage folks to do that. We'll give you a minute to do that. Open up with any questions. Um, uh, yeah, there's lots of people talking about examples and stuff of people of co-ops that have gotten a lot of support from the state or from representatives, and conversations about like, is that considered political behavior and does that harm our co-op? So I thought that was interesting, Katie, because I know you've helped a lot of startups that have worked with
Uh-huh.
representatives and so forth, and I thought you could speak to whether that's really been a factor, an issue.
That's a great question. I'm going to stop sharing the slides so I can see more people. There we go. So that's a great question. In this day and age, considering our politics is a significant undertaking to say the least. But what I will say is that we all eat. Food is important to all of us. So I encourage you to build relationships with all of your representatives, regardless of party affiliation, and maintain them consistently, equally. You may connect with one or the other, one party or another, but your relationship with them on behalf of the co-op should be professional and consistent. We want them to know who we are, how we organize, what's important to us, and what our values are. And 90% of the time, we're going to share the same values, regardless of party. I mean, we all eat, we all want access to food, we all want healthy food. It's rare that you're going to find someone who says they don't want those things. So it can be political, but I encourage you to take the politics out of it and focus more on what we have in common when you're building those relationships than what separates us.
Yeah, good. I wanted you to speak to that. So people are talking about legally, like, nope, nope, legally you're a for-profit business. You
Yep,
can, as much as any other business, but also notice most of the for-profit businesses that you go to, locally owned or not, are not also endorsing candidates on the front of their store. There's pros and cons to doing that sort of thing.
hmm,
So
absolutely.
those are choices you make. But I wanted you to thank you for talking about because I know you've been in work with co-ops directly who've been ex have been doing that work. Let's see what just got some. Yeah. That's absolutely true. Yeah, we're asking people don't unmute. So we're at this point, but are you up for an unmuter? Or would we prefer let's keep it in the chat. So Nick, your go, but I need your question in the chat. And Henry just pointed out the co-ops have been supported and not supported in various ways by all sorts of both parties historically speaking at
Absolutely.
different
Yep.
times.
Yep.
So that kind of moves around. Any co-ops you can think of that have started with a smaller floor print due to funding and eventually increased in size or moved to a bigger store. Not, I'm gonna put a pin in that. If we don't get other questions a little more specific to what we've been doing right now, we can circle back to that. I wanted to see if any, it's just because that's a big combo.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's a big combo. And so if that's where we end up wanting to go, that's fine. I was just checking because I know Nick had a question. I'm like, you're gonna throw it in the chat. And it was more specific to these funding buckets and how we're funding, but I'm not seeing it. All right. Do you want to field that one first, Katie? Oh, is
Sure,
Nick?
the smaller
I
footprint
guess we're jumping to Nick's. Okay, so
question,
oh
is
no,
that
I
what you're
think
asking?
this question is more appropriate to what we've been talking about. Not that Heather's a wrong question, just listen more specific. We'll get back to that. So we're currently evaluating the idea of a seed round of donors to get us started before
Hmm.
doing the big capital campaign. We're curious
Hmm.
if anyone's ever done this before. Oh, you asked the right person, Katie.
Indeed, indeed, this has been done. In fact, my home co-op, Green Top Grocery, did this initially, and they even called them seed funders. So you're right on track with something that has already been done. It was very informal. In fact, I joined the co-op as a volunteer after this happened. So it had happened already. So I'm aware it happened. I wasn't part of the creation of it, but they pooled funding from their strongest supporters, board members, steering committee members, passionate local farmers, environmental advocates in the community, and they used that funding to pay for the initial market study. And I think what happened, that was their intent, was to pull that funding to do an initial market study. Then at that, soon after we pulled those funds together, Green Top was awarded a grant from FCI. And FCI, that grant was specifically to pay for a market study. And so we reallocated those funds then to hire an outreach manager, which was me. So I was the recipient of those seed funds, or the co-op was the recipient, and I was the person hired as a result of those seed funds to do some outreach and owner growth work for Green Top Grocery. So it absolutely can be done, although you do have to be careful about timing of your fundraising. So people, there is such a thing as donor fatigue. And I use the word donor. We're talking about investments and donations here, but I use donor fatigue because it's a fundraising industry terminology. But what it means basically is that we can't ask people for money over and over and expect them to continue. People are going to get tired. They're going to move on to other causes. They're going to get frustrated with repeated asks. And so you want to time your seed fundraising, separate from other fundraising that you're going to need to do, which in our world is usually not a problem. These things happen, years apart from each other, typically. But absolutely can be done. Good
That
question.
was super valuable, so I'm glad we talked about that. And I suspect Nick's talking about the silent phase.
Oh yes, and absolutely. If we're talking about the silent phase, then abs
And if you mind, do you mind defining the
100%.
silent phase for folks just real quick?
Absolutely. So the silent phase of fundraising is the fundraising that happens quietly before you announce to the public, announce to your owners that you're raising capital, that you're selling shares, that you're soliciting loans from co-op members. And what the intent of that silent phase is to solidify a foundation that serves as momentum for your capital campaign. And we like to see a co-op raise 10 to 20% of their overall campaign goal in the silent phase. So if you're trying to raise $1 million, let's say, for round numbers, we'd want the silent phase dollar figure to be, 100 to $200,000 that you're raising. Same group of people that I mentioned before, your strongest supporters, your volunteers, your board members, your community activists in the community, the influencers, the people of strong recognition in your community. You want to get them on board early on during that silent phase so that when you start shouting from the rooftops, "Hey, we're raising $1 million. Oh, and by the way, we already raised 200,000." And these are the great people who have supported us already. You build that momentum. You get that excitement happening.
I'm finding from the chat that you had it right the first time. They were
Oh,
talking about CD, which is a much rarer thing. So actually, I'm glad you asked. Well, Katie's here because very few co-ops have done that, and I know you didn't run it, but Katie's co-op did do that. It's much more uncommon.
it is.
So he's
Yes.
asking like, would you do it again? Would you ask for more? The option is
Mhm.
we don't really know because none of us actually did it ourselves. But what are your thoughts, Katie?
Yeah, I'd say if it's done well and it's done right, I think it's valuable. The value comes in the relationship that you build with those seed funders. In every capital campaign that I've worked on, I should say, in every capital campaign that I've worked on that required multiple phases, and only a handful haven't required multiple phases, but in every one, there are repeat investors. So someone who lends the co-op money initially, lends $5,000, oftentimes will come back during phase two, during the next phase of fundraising and say, okay, I can give you 2,000 more. I can give you 7,000 total. And they do that because we have a good relationship with them because they're invested, they understand our values align. The same can happen with these seed funders. If you build strong relationships with them, if you keep in touch with them, if you keep them updated, if they feel valued and instrumental to your success, they're going to continue to want to support you. And so that can pay dividends down the road then when you are raising larger amounts of capital during a fund drive, a capital drive like we're talking about here.
All right. Calling it, I like that when someone jumped in and said they're calling it the super secret phase, the super secret phase,
Secret.
though also still is the seed phase. Yeah, so it's been done. I really liked your thoughts on that, Katie. I thought that was really helpful to hear. Okay, do we have other questions on funding buckets? This is funding adjacent, so I'm fine with this going here. I just wanted to check. Okay. So the question was, are there any co-ops you can think of that have started with a smaller floor footprint due to it being hard to fund? So maybe they wanted a fuller size store. Their markets they said they should have flushed, but due to funding, they went with a smaller footprint and have eventually increased in size or moved to a bigger store. And if you wanted to field that one, or if you wanted me to.
I think you're probably more well positioned to answer that, JQ, than I am. I'll let you answer.
Okay, I want you to take the next one though. So I'm going to pitch this up. Are there dangers to overly large foundation donations? So you think that one through
Hmm,
while I answer this one.
okay.
So yes, we've seen it, and there's a couple success stories, and of the ones that have done it, I'd say they're 10% at most. Generally, there's two problems to opening smaller. One is sometimes one's not a problem. A lot of times you get open and just running that store is about as much as you can take, and you're running, and you're paying off the debt, and you're 10 years later, all of a sudden you realize you're still not in a position to expand. But the store is serving the community and doing great things. So it's not a bad thing. Then we have a percentage, I would say, that truly fail because they do too small a store for the size of community and demand. And there's a lot of factors in that. That would be a whole session. And then there's about 10% at most that do start smaller and are able within a decade to expand their footprint significantly. Dill Pickle Food Co-op comes to mind.
Hmm.
Most of the other ones I would say started the size they expected, were able to expand within the first 10 years because they were doing so well, but they didn't go smaller and then expand. They went the size they'd meant to and just were able to expand. So very few examples of it, and I could go into far more depth about the pros and cons and the whys and how to assess if you're in that situation, but that's a whole session. So I'm going to hand this back to Katie.
So the question is dangers to accepting large foundation contributions, right? So off the top of my head, I don't think so. My gut says no, that there isn't. When we're having conversations with larger foundations, with any investor, for that matter, aligning our values is very important. So if our values are aligned, if they understand what we're doing, if they understand that we're one member, one vote, that this funding does not come with any strings, does not come with any control, does not require either party to do anything else but what we agree to in the funding agreement. I don't see a downside with that. Now the entity giving the money could be of concern. I don't know that someone is going to give us money that doesn't align with our values. For example, like if Monsanto wanted to give us $1 million, I might wonder why and not want consider what the strings might be attached to that. But I don't envision anything like that happening. And if we're aligned values wise, I don't foresee a problem.
I don't want to talk about someone's story without their permission, so you can check it out in the chat. Alan has mentioned in the chat a
Mm.
situation where there was a profoundly large donor behind a startup, and I would say that made it very difficult for that startup to move forward and succeed. There was too much control. So I
Mm.
think there is an example, but
Hmm.
it's not our story to tell, and I'm not going to put it in this video. But the name is in the chat, and Alan is correct. I would share that thought. So, one thing I think I'd love to, this kind of adjacent. So I'm gonna have one minute. If anyone has one, we're gonna have time for a couple more questions. Katie, I'm at relationship management. I've seen two startups now that got large local grants where I'd say maybe there was no risk, like nothing bad happened, but those donors didn't, there were relationship issues. Those donors didn't necessarily felt like they saw manifest what was promised to them. And that it caused a lot of
Mm.
stress and strain for the board. And I just
Mm.
wonder if you have any thoughts on how what we promise to our partners and how we manage that relationship. Often GMs don't pick up that relationship management from the grant. They're running the store. And I wonder if you've run into
Right.
any of this or had thoughts on it.
All right. Oh gosh, that's a big topic and important, very important. And as I mentioned with the foundation example, alignment I think is important, and that alignment comes with communication. Oftentimes these what we could call problems or bumps in the road could be improved with better communication. And so I think it's important that all parties, whether they're big donors or funders, foundations, are on the same page we are and consistently on the same page that we are. So building some systems into your co-op that facilitate that kind of communication can help with that. So just off the top of my head, in a scenario like this, I'm thinking that if we had an email list with this group of people on it, that these are our big funders, or these are the people we need to maintain our funding relationships with, we have a system in place to keep them updated regularly so that when a GM takes over, that can be a task that either the GM is responsible for or delegated to someone within the staff so that we don't have that breakdown in communication. It happens. I mean, we have great hopes and dreams and ideas for what our stores will be, and then reality happens, and there's a million and one things to do when the store opens, and oftentimes we're prioritizing what we can get to, what gets to the top of our list. And if those things we promised aren't at the top of our list, we need to be having communications with the folks we promised them to and say, hey, we know we said that we would do this. It's still on our list. We want to do that, but here's reality. Here's where we are right now. But I think communication can often help us in these kinds of situations.
And I will say that in the two examples I can think of, those relationships have been rebuilt, but there
Mm.
were a couple of rocky years, and the board had to really invest in like having the conversations. So just,
Yeah.
like they had to like, oh, these are local donors. They're a big foundation, but they're local. We need to really rebuild these relationships. We need to have conversations. We need to help them understand what we're doing. So again, the
Mhm.
communication, just like Katie said. We've got a question here, and I'm gonna kind of take this one, but then I'll try and shut up, which is, the whole like, the basically we're told to find a site and then raise the money and then start building out, and that a lot of landlords, aren't taking us seriously because we don't have any of the money raised yet. And I will say this is not a new problem. So first, I want to put that out there. I've been hearing this from startup food co-ops from before I worked at FCI. So this is an ongoing challenge of being a cooperative and them not understanding the model, and people have absolutely lost sites because of it, but a lot of people in really challenging real estate markets have not lost sites because of when they found the right landlord. I'm not saying that there isn't, again, like innovation's awesome. That's what the Katie's whole session's about. Maybe we do have to raise a certain amount of money, before we go looking for a site. Maybe there's a new way we think about doing that. I'm certainly not against it. Innovation's awesome. I will say this problem has existed for well over 10 years and in some of the toughest real estate markets I've ever seen, and co-ops have still gotten open. So it's tough to educate them on it, and people do lose sites because of it, but less often than you'd think, would be my take. Katie, what do you think?
Agreed. Yep, I agree. And I think the same way about innovation, some trying new things. We don't know something doesn't work till we try it. And then we know if it works or not. And then we can teach other people how to do it. So it may be that in this instance that we're describing here, we have to raise some funds ahead of time. And maybe that's part of our communication strategy, that we're raising this amount of money now and we're going to raise this amount of money later. And so that when we go to raise money later, people aren't like, wait a minute, you already asked me this, but we're clearly communicating about the process all along. Oh, you're
That,
on mute. Oh, there
that's
you go.
really, really well said. Actually, I forgot. I'm going to give an example real quick, which is actually oh, I'm forgetting the name, but St. Johnsbury, New York, they just did that. They actually got committed to a lease that they really, 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 really wanted, and they were given like a month and a half to raise several hundred thousand, just to kind of, they need to raise more than that, but to prove that they could like raise
Yeah.
money. And that was an interesting compromise. So think about that too. It's like, well,
Hmm.
let's sign a possible, option, and then let's give us 2 months to go raise, a quarter of a million. And they did that, and it was very effective. So and then they had to go out and raise the rest of it. But I'm gonna wrap us up because we need to wrap up on time because Katie's wiggled this in for us, and she's got something she's got to get to next. So I want to just take a moment here and thank Katie again for for a terrific session and for giving her time and expertise and experience to us today. Deeply, deeply appreciated. I did want to say that if you want a copy of the PDF of the slides from tonight, please put your email in the chat. I will share it with Katie, and then Katie will send you those slides. So if you want a copy of the slides, please put your email in the chat, and I'll share that with her. And that survey's coming. I don't think anyone in this room hasn't been a previous session. So please fill out the survey. It's anonymous, and we'll share the responses, Katie, as well as FCI. We both benefit from it. We really appreciate it. We need just one last chance. This is our last one, so I can't tell you what's coming up next. What's coming up next is up and coming September, Kalamazoo. We hope we'll see you there. And we will have some other intermittent sessions in between, but not a whole series like this. Thank you for participating. Thank you for being a part of it. And thank you to our record number of sponsors this year who made it possible for this series to happen. We're grateful to all of them and their belief in the startup food co-op movement.